welcome to our final bias event of Science Gallery's final bias event. Fair is fair, isn't it? A discussion on AI and fairness. This event marks the culmination of Science Gallery Dublin's collaboration with Accenture the Doc, which has been taking place over the past year and really interrogating some of the key themes that we were looking at in the context of the overall program of events and the exhibition Bias. So looking at AI, trust, and ethics. And we are all biased. We naturally prefer certain people or things and often make decisions based on subjective beliefs or gut instincts rather than facts. Bias is a lens that distorts how we understand the world, warping our perception of reality in ways that are often unconscious and deeply ingrained. From cognitive function to machine learning, bias is a shortcut, both for our brains and machines when processing data. And prejudice can move quickly from human to machine as algorithms and artificial intelligence systems are encoded by humans with very human values, preferences, and predispositions. As part of our collaboration with Accenture the Doc, we had a Curator-in-Residence program with Julia Kaginski, where she worked with the Accenture Labs on their artificial intelligence research. And out of that came a commission, which was with the artists Alexander Taylor and Risa Puno, who's joining us this evening. We have an amazing panel to discuss artificial intelligence and fairness this evening, including Risa the artist, and Maeve Corcoran, who was the lead researcher who leads Accenture Labs in Science Gallery, and Milo Phillips-Brown, or in Accenture the Doc, and Milo Phillips-Brown, and then Dave Lewis, who is moderating the conversation, who is Associate Professor in Computer Science and Deputy Director of the ADAPT Research Centre. So I won't go on for too much longer. I would encourage all of you who haven't been in to see the exhibition already to come in over the next week. We're into our final week and a half of the exhibition. So it's on at the moment through to Sunday, and then next week from Wednesday to Sunday, finishing that day. So please do come in, experience the interactive exhibit, which you'll hear about this evening, and some more of the themes. So I'll hand you over now to Dave Lewis, and thanks so much, Dave.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aisling. So we're going to just go through, I think, a bit of a broad conversation about some of the issues that have been on our minds as the bias exhibit was running and being prepared. So I'll quickly introduce you a little bit more detail to our panel. First, we have Maeve Corcoran, who leads Accenture Labs in Ireland. So that's one of the 7 key research hubs that Accenture has around the world. It's based in the wonderful facility called the Dock, just down the road from the Science Gallery here in Dublin. And there Maeve works on incubating prototypes and new concepts that are applied through R&D and expected to have a significant strategic impact on what Accenture does. And she's recently been leading the global responsible AI work there. Then our second panelist is Risa Puno, who Ashley mentioned already. She's a New York City-based sculpture and installation artist who uses interactivity and play to understand how we relate to one another. And she's been dealing with the very challenging issues of how to talk about computer bias and present that in an installation that you can see at the exhibit. And then finally, we have Milo Phillips-Brown, who's an Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Oxford, and he is a member there of the Oxford Institute of Ethics in AI and a Senior Fellow of Digital Ethics and Governance at the Jane Family Institute there. So we're hopefully going to have an interesting and interactive discussion. There is also a Q&A feature on this webinar, so if you do have questions that come along as we go forward, do type them in, and we'll try and keep an eye on those as we go along, or try and catch a few of them as we get towards the end of the session. So, perhaps to start off, I might turn to you first, Maeve. And we throw sort of words like fairness and bias around. And I wonder, perhaps you could start off by, perhaps giving a bit of an audience of, what we were hoping people would get from the exhibit, and what perhaps some of the key concepts and distinctions between some of these terms when we talk about fairness.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Dave. I guess maybe just to start out, just use 2 terms there, bias and fairness, and often in the media they're used interchangeably, but in actual fact they're not actually the exact same thing. Bias is actually a feature of statistical models, whereas fairness is a feature of human value judgment. So usually, like often human value judgment judges that bias models are unfair. So usually bias is a subset of unfairness, but fairness is actually is wider than that. So you can have AI systems that are statistically unbiased but still considered unfair. I give a quick example of that. So say you're a company building a new product where you wanted to be able to tag pictures that were being uploaded for sports events, you know, to be able to suggest emojis or whatever to whoever's uploading it. So you're training it, say you're training it on a foot racing data set, and you train your model and you find out at the end, actually, the model doesn't work very well for people in wheelchairs that are on those races. And because it's a very small proportion of your data set, which represents in this scenario, the real life. So from a statistical point of view, your view is the model is not biased because it's reflecting, there isn't a strong enough signal in real life. But actually from a fairness point of view, if you're thinking about inclusion, actually that can be seen as quite unfair, you know, that you build a product that doesn't actually identify people in a wheelchair in a race as racing. So actually to fix that, you might actually introduce bias into the model, so that to the model training set, so that you can pick them up. So that's just the difference between bias and fairness. But then actually digging down into fairness, because I think that's a really interesting part, and Risa will get into it a bit more when she talks about the exhibition. But fairness, because it's a human value judgment, actually there are lots of different definitions of fairness. Three of the main ones that you often hear about are sameness. So that's where, like equality, everybody it gets the same. And so if you think of it from example of schools and how much is spent on children, in that case, every pupil in a school would have the exact same amount spent on them. Then there is what's called deservedness, which is around the better you are, the more you get. And in that situation, say a school might spend more on the most academically gifted children. And then a third definition is need. And that's actually where you give the most to people who need it the most. So in that school, maybe it's, say, the kids with the most need would get the most spent on them. So as you can see, there are actually different definitions of fairness, conflicting definitions, and actually it's very hard. You can't actually usually meet all of them together. And when for individuals, even when they think something is fair, is very context specific. So say in that school example, someone might think, okay, need is the right type of fairness to use. But say the same person, if you're talking about getting into an elite sports team, deservedness is usually the definition of fairness that's used there. And there are a number of other factors that influence it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it's really important to understand those distinctions, you know, especially, I mean, you know, for us on the sort of the engineering and computer science side, you know, we deal a lot with the numbers, but we have to be willing to engage with some of these more, you know, everyday topics, you know, essentially, you know, differences that, you know, we discuss in our politics, really, when we talk about these different strands of fairness. So I might turn to you, Risa. I mean, you had you know, embrace the challenge to sort of try and you know, capture aspects of these ideas, and you had the installation in the bias exhibit. I think it was called "Most Likely to Succeed." I'd be interested. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit of just about how you went around, you know, what you're trying to sort of communicate with that piece, and how you actually went about taking some of these different definitions and concepts and turning it into an interactive installation.
Sure, thanks. Well, thanks for having me. And yeah, this was a really interesting project because, I mean, my collaborator, Alex Taylor, is an artist and creative technologist. So he definitely has like a toehold in tech considerations, whereas I am a complete technology muggle, and I had to learn a lot. For me, AI seemed like magic. I had no idea what went into that. So learning a lot about how it works, the things that we're aware of, the things we're not aware of, and the decisions that go into constructing them was fascinating to me. And I mean, I feel like I learned that everybody's just trying, right? But it's still, things are still emerging and things are still developing. And so that's something that I really wanted to think about. I wanted to make a project that got people thinking about how things are constructed, right? And the decisions that we make that go into them. And I mean, a lot of the work I make involves games, and I think the games work really well as sort of metaphors for larger social systems. There's like often a goal and obstacles to that goal and rules of engagement. So that's the format that I went with. And so as you can see in the background image, that is the game part of this exhibition. There's this sort of maze, and you're trying to get as many balls through the maze as quickly as possible before your time runs out. The catch is that, like, you realize the more time you have, the more likely you are to get more balls through, the more likely you are to succeed. And the thing that assigns how much time you get to play is an AI system built by Alex Taylor. And so it's this sort of webcam controlled thing. It looks like an arcade booth, and you sit down in front of the screen, and there's these prompts that tell you to like catch like circles, not squares. And so you're sitting there moving your head, trying to do it. And we made up like little tasks that have to do with things that theoretically relate to the physical game, like balance, dexterity, but you're not even using your hands. You're just using your head, right? So first of all, there's already a question of how accurate of a like proxy for that final game is this, right? And so based on your performance with those virtual tasks, it determines how likely it thinks you are to succeed at the physical game, right? And then assigns you a time. And you come to realize that it gives more time to people who it thinks are more likely to succeed, which follows things like loans, right? Or jobs or places in a school. But in a game, usually you're trying to level the playing field. So in that format, it gives a little bit of a, wait, what? Like it's more time, if I'm more likely to succeed. And it brings up questions like, so that essentially means, first of all, if it even is predicting correctly, which is a big if, but if it's even predicting correctly, the people who aren't, say, likely to do well will essentially never get the practice, right? And so in terms of what Maeve was talking about the different ways it's optimized, if it were optimized for need, right, to sort of counteract that, it would be the other way. You'd get more time if you were less likely to succeed. If it were about equality and parity, you wouldn't even need the AI because everybody would get the same amount of time. And then, but the way we have it set up, deservedness is a tough term. I understand it's an industry term, but for someone like me, it's like fairness in that it feels very subjective. So for me, the way I was thinking about it is optimized for efficiency, right? Like there's only like a finite amount of time that this exists in the gallery. So it doesn't want to waste time on people that it doesn't think are going to do well. So that's how we were sort of framing it. And so it is optimized for efficiency currently. And so you play the game after that, you get like a little sticker on this sort of leaderboard thing that shows your data point within all the people who have played. And then you get a little printout that shows some information about your, some like feedback about your performance and some like tips, like if you had, if your focus had been 12% better, you would have, been predicted to be 85% likely to succeed and would have received 1 more minute of game time, things like that, right? And so it basically takes these issues and puts it in a way where there is like some risk and a sense of stakes, but it's much lower stakes. And by making it like sort of fun like that, it's easier to talk about, right? Versus when you're talking about people's like livelihoods and things like that. And the idea is that hopefully from there, people can talk about how it relates to the real world. And the Science Gallery mediators have been amazing with that, like in terms of engaging people and getting them to think deeper about it.
Yeah, no, that sounds fascinating. And I mean, did you find it was an important part then that there was that sort of physical competitive element potentially to the game? Is that something that sort of comes up in some of your other works as well, that you're getting people almost to sort of compete against each other or interact with each other?
Absolutely. I mean, in some of my projects, it's a question of like I do some where people have to choose whether to cooperate or compete, but that idea of that competitive drive is definitely something that I use a lot in my work. And I think for this project, it really fit well because that's often how people are in life, right? Like you're just trying to do well, you're trying to succeed. And in a game, winning is often seen as success.
Yeah, no, that's really true. So maybe I just might ask, did you find that an interesting factor, looking at it from the, if you like, the sort of the technical research and development processes? Because I think you were talking to us, before we started, a little bit about some of the work that you do, where you get people almost to take roles, adversarial roles in the design process, to sort of try and explore some of the edges of issues around AI design and bias, etc.
Yeah. So we call it unintended consequencing, where we get people to think through, if you're building something, what could go wrong or what could go right that you're not thinking about, but more often what could go wrong, and really dig deep on that. But I think in terms of working with Risa and Alex, I think their approach to developing this was very different to anything we've done before. And we've worked before with, say, experienced companies to try and get across to non-technical people our technical research. But you like, it's like usually it's a video with example that explains it or whatever. Whereas the way that Risa approached it was really to create an experience to get people to ask questions, to sort of shock them a little bit and get the conversation going. And through doing that, and through doing it in something that the person can participate with rather than just watching something on a screen, it really leads to people, I think, getting a better understanding of it, and actually something that sticks with them, that they actually think about afterwards. That actually it lingers, rather than, oh, that was a fun game and let's move on.
Yeah. And I guess there's something really sort of base and emotional about being in sort of, and even if it's in a friendly environment, being in competitive or adversarial situations. And I think it does really push you to sort of think and imagine situations a bit harder. I might perhaps turn to you, Milo. The bias exhibit is a great creative way to invest some sort of time and expertise and resources into sort of having these discussions with a public audience. But we have to find ways to do this more frequently, to engage with with people about some of these very complex issues that aren't sort of constrained to a particular area. These aren't, though computer scientists and engineers are involved in building things, they don't sort of really own the problem space, and especially in your institute, you have those interactions between philosophers, people in social sciences, and the computing and engineering side. So, but could you say a little bit about how you address those interdisciplinary differences, and also how you can sort of use that to engage with the public more?
Absolutely, yeah. So Maeve mentioned before these sort of different conceptions of what makes something fair, and these are the kind of questions that philosophers have been thinking about for a really long time. What is it that you are trying to capture when you call a certain kind of thing fairness? Is it maybe that one of those things that Maeve mentioned, it's like on the basis of need or equality, or whether we want to say what you deserve, or on the basis of efficiency? People have thought a long time and made arguments that one of those things is actually what deserves to be called fairness, and another isn't. So I think that's one thing there, is that there are conversations to be had that go beyond an initial sense of, oh, this is fair, or oh, this is not fair. And I think that's one very cool thing that the installation brings out, that I think has already come up, that you're confronted with this, that it kind of it switches your perception of, okay, well, this is something that would seem entirely fair to me. The idea that the person who is estimated to do best and gets the most time. That seems entirely fair in the setting of sports or something, but it doesn't make sense in this context. And then that sort of opens you up to thinking, well, should it be that way in the sports setting, or should it be that way in the education setting? So it sort of sets you up to think in these different ways. So, I mean, I do think that there are ways to kind of dig deeper once we sort of start getting people to appreciate the kind of the subtlety here and to kind of feel it in that game-like way. As far as sort of how we get these conversations going more. So you mentioned this institute that I'm a part of. We have also online kind of webinars exactly like this kind of thing. If you just Google the Institute for Ethics and AI, conversations, maybe usually an hour and a half long, where we talk about all different sorts of topics in AI ethics, fairness being one of them. Maybe I'll stop there. I could keep going, but I'll pause there. Yeah.
I mean, I think it is interesting to explore that. I mean, we the Science Gallery, I think, sort of, it's there, it's there to educate and to entertain, and it's designed to be fun. We want to attract people to it, but it is interesting. I think something we touched on before is these topics are starting to become quite real in the especially in Europe. There's legislation coming down the line about how we're going to regulate AI, and they tend to be sort of couched in quite sort of technocratic mechanisms, and they talk about you do risk analysis and incidence reports, so things that language that people would be quite accustomed to in corporate governance,
sure,
in that sense. But they don't go into the details, so and they refer to standards will help, but it's an area I work in, and I know they're not going to go into those. They might say, well, here's what you would measure if you were trying to achieve this type of fairness, based on merit rather than need, or deservedness. There's different options, and here's your menu, but it doesn't, they won't tell you, which one you should take in which particular circumstances. So that does come back, I think there is a gap that will come back to, the public or their political representatives, and should do, because I don't think we should, certainly I don't feel I should be in a sort of a standards committee room deciding these things. They come back to. So I mean, do you sort of have much of a feel from the experience you've had, either in work that you've done on public engagement, or even the teaching you do to probably quite a sort of broad range of students, of how to get those discussions happening, because we're gonna have to sort of collectively take responsibility for these things potentially quite soon once we start talking about legislation. We can't ignore these problems for many more years now.
Absolutely, yeah. So I work a lot with computer science students, trying to get them to appreciate exactly what you're saying, how what they're going to be building is going to affect the world and potentially make things less fair, or as kind of Maeve alluded to, things could also get more fair depending on how they end up building things. And so these questions of fairness is something that we're talking about all the time. So this is, I'm teaching some classes on this in the coming weeks. Basically, we're talking about just this kind of thing. So I think there are a couple different parts to it. One is to understand how the technical decisions that you might be making when you build something can inadvertently lead to fairness or unfairness. So just to try to be able to map on the possible effects, fair or unfair, to what you're building. Like how is what I'm building right now potentially going to affect the world in a certain way? And then you've got a certain kind of choice about what world you want to make when you're building, when you're making this technology. And I think one thing that we can think about are, and this is what we tried to bring into the classroom, are theories from the humanities and the social sciences about, for example, like racism and sexism. So we have, have them read papers about what racism and sexism looks like on the ground, so from a sociological perspective, and then some more theory about these things too, to try to make kind of more concrete in a different way than the game does, what we're kind of talking about in flesh and blood when we're talking about fairness. No,
I mean, it is really, because it does talk to that, perhaps sort of breadth in, perhaps our education that we need to have. We tend to sort of go to, especially third level education, to specialize more, but
right.
I think we got to be careful not to do too much of that. You actually have to take the advantage, take the opportunity to learn some of these broader concepts. I might perhaps loop back to you, Maeve, a little bit about, obviously you're dealing with these issues sort of in practice, in Accenture, and how, I suppose, what one of the core questions you come to about with AI, we're sort of, in some sense, we're sort of quantifying things more, and actually how we sort of set up the parameters of our AI systems and the decisions or assumptions we make about what we mean by fairness can have big ramifications because of the scalability of the technology, I guess. So what insights do you have in terms of who is it who actually gets to make these decisions, and how, I suppose, in the sense, how explicitly do they make those decisions, or sometimes responsibility abdicated perhaps to the technology? I mean, what sort of experience do you have with that, Maeve?
Yeah, well, I think it's becoming more and more clear, like you mentioned, there's legislation coming, but that it's the people that or the companies that develop and use the AI that are responsible for the outcomes, including the fairness of the AI. So in the EU legislation, I think it's quite clear, like, because oftentimes these days you also have, say, third parties, say a bank might buy a model off a third party, and in the end, it like at the moment in the EU, it might be different in other areas. The idea is that it's the bank's responsibility because they're the ones where the rubber hits the road, where they actually make the decisions on people. They're the ones that are obligated to make sure that it's working as promised. So that, I mean, I think that's going to be an interesting aspect of the regulation, because obviously if the banks need to know, then they need the third party people who are building the models to know, so they can, so that's a whole different kettle of fish. But I mean, I think in terms of a lot of what Milo was saying, the developer, they make a lot of decisions, what model to use, what data to use, lots of assumptions, and then what checks to do as they're building it. So, and hopefully, Dave, as he mentioned, they have standards, because I think that's another thing. You can have people work in a model development team that are a year or two out of college. Like, it's really important that there's guardrails, because also, like we were talking about, fairness is a value judgment. So different companies will have different views of what's fair, and when you're working with a company, you can obviously challenge them, but you should be adhering to what the company's definition of fair is, and that should be clear. And I guess so, as people who develop, but as well the people who actually deploy them and actually are using them in live, because oftentimes that's different than the developer. So, in Risa's model, like we saw, or sort of AI system, the decision was made by Alex or Risa, to use deservedness or whatever you call it, Risa, but basically that was a decision made after the model was built. It was the person implementing the model and making decisions decided to use that definition. So in that situation, they're the person that's responsible for, is that fair or not fair?
Yeah, and I suppose they need to understand when they're making those decisions that have the heavier sort of ethical consequences compared to, you know, which programming language or database platform they're using, which may be less consequential. So I wonder as well, I mean, you know, there was a little mention there as well about the potential for AI actually to make some things actually fairer, you know, and I'm sure that could sort of, you know, happen statistically. But do you think maybe is there a factor of this as well, that, you know, once we sort of, you know, quantify things through data and feed it into AI, and we start to understand the levers that we have to perhaps try and make it a bit fair, it sort of does raise that question of, you know, how you know, modern machine learning AI systems are all based on sort of existing historical data. So it does sort of put the focus on that existing data and probably sort of quantify some of our historic decisions a little bit more than we'd be comfortable with. You know, so I can imagine if you're talking about a system that was sort of selecting CVs for shortlisting in a recruitment process, and you know, and you'll say, well, you know, we don't want that to be biased, but you know, what level of bias is acceptable? You know, ultimately it is a human backstop on that situation. You know, human still makes the decision. They may just be shortlisting people, and that does, you know, make you think, well, so what do we used to take as acceptable? You know, and then you have to quantify that to be able to know how much you want to improve it by. I mean, do you see those sort of effects starting to happen? Just the drive to, you know, automate or, you know, provide AI that helps with decisions, the quantification of that, and then looking at some of these issues of fairness and going back and quantifying them over your historic data. Does that reveal things a little bit, you know, to organizations about what they've done in the past that they perhaps haven't even thought of?
Yeah, I think it makes decisions, at least we're measuring the unfairness or the bias now. Like oftentimes, you know, if you had individuals making decisions about, I don't know, credit loans or insurance or whatever, you know, they have a set of standards that they learn, but the reality is, you know, people make different decisions, and maybe sometimes they make errors, but they cancel each other out. You know, even no AI model is 100% accurate either. So, you know, there's always going to be errors, whether it's human or AI. But I think the difference is with AI, we now can measure it and see if there's an issue. Okay, how do we correct that? But it's interesting, like Dave, when you're talking about historic bias, you know, in CVs, one that I was encountered recently, like with insurance companies, you know, when they're looking at, say, for medical insurance over history, because, you know, medicine is moving on all the time, they actually have to go through and manually look at the historic data, and maybe, you know, an action they took 5 years ago isn't the right action today because, you know, whatever, the disease is much more treatable today, so you'd actually make a different decision. So it's interesting. I mean, and before AI was even a thing for them, they were doing, you know, they were going back and looking at these things, you know, when they were looking at data analytics and things. So, you know, it's been there a long time. I think it's now making it more standardized.
Yeah. And it's interesting, you know, again, you know, there are examples. This is sort of happening a little bit more, I think, in medical research as well, this sort of focus on bias and quantifying it and going back and looking at data, and they're realizing actually there's, you know, data sets that we based a lot of our scientific knowledge on, you know, like cell samples and things, and we've no idea whether they came from men or women because we were trying to do the right thing and avoid collecting more data than we needed. And now, as knowledge progresses, we think perhaps we should have known that. You know, perhaps we're drawing some of the wrong conclusions. I have a, you know, perhaps just quickly going back to Milo, a question that always fascinates me a little bit about this from a sort of a philosophical perspective as well. You know, we're even talking about that experience of, you know, because, you know, we're trying to find ways to manage bias because AI is helping to quantify it. We look at what we've done previously. So we're looking at our, you know, our past lives through a sort of a quantitative, you know, statistical view. I mean, but do you have any concerns about how that sort of impacts and sort of, not so much issues of fairness, but perhaps also our sense of autonomy, that feeling that we're being over quantified, or our past decisions are being judged now because we can quantify them a little bit better. How does that, there could be a real sort of ethical conflict between different aspects that we regard as important to ourselves, between fairness and autonomy. What would an ethicist have to say in that?
No, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think this is often maybe somewhat, overlooked piece of the fairness discussion is that sometimes, I mean, just to allow things to be more fair in some kind of way. I mean, to take Maeve's earlier example, is if we have more data on people in wheelchairs, or algorithm might be better able to predict or estimate how they're going to do when they get on the track. And that's going to be similar across many, many different domains. So think about search recommendation, for example, that when you make a search and the results are personalized, but let's say that you're part of a group that is minority group. So most of the people doing the searching aren't like you. And if the algorithm is trying to learn on the basis of what most people search for, they're going to make bad recommendations for you. So they have to know more and more about you to make recommendations that are as good about you as they are for other people. But then I think there is this concern that you're alluding to, Dave, that is basically like, do you sort of cease to have a life that is your own, basically, if everything is being quantified, even in the service of fairness? I think that's a deep question that, like a good philosopher will say, good question. Let me think about
we'll come back in 3,000 years.
Exactly.
Because I had an email from, as you do as an academic, you have to sort of report on your progress and aim for various key performance indicators. I had an email saying you've got to get these filled in, and it has to be done by such and such a day, and if you don't do that, you'll be docked so many points from I don't even know what for. And it was just that sinking feeling of I'm doing something to produce numbers, and if I don't get them right, I'll lose some other numbers. But what does it mean for my life? I think perhaps you might perhaps just the last question, Risa. We're getting near the end of it. I'd be interested in sort of your takeaway, both as an artist, but as a sort of a lay person, perhaps not exposed to, some of these, philosophical and also technical issues. Well, what were some of the key takeaways from your experience of engaging with the exhibit and with people like Maeve?
I think in making it, Alex and I saw how many opportunities there were to influence like the outcome, the decisions that we made. Like, so not only did we choose to optimize it for efficiency, we also had to think, okay, so what are the metrics that we're measuring and what are good ways to measure them, right? And the way that applies to things like whether or not you get a loan, right? And how much you get. It's like things like looking at how much somebody keeps in their bank account as a regular thing. It's like, well, that's what they kept in their bank account before they had a loan to pay back, so that past behavior does not necessarily indicate future behavior, right? And so thinking about things like that, those decisions that get made every step of the way is something that I think both of us really connected to. And thinking about how people experience it. Something that was fascinating when we were playtesting it was, in trying to elicit a conversation, like, is this fair? Does this AI assessment seem fair? So many people were like, well, yeah, it's a computer, so obviously it's fair, right? And there's that assumption. And so I guess something that I hope that people take from it is to understand that people have a right and even a responsibility to question how things are built, to hold people accountable. Because when you think about the people making the decisions for things, right? Like if you take the people who are running the businesses and thinking about how much culture is shaped by those decisions, these people aren't like elected, not to mention the goals of, say, society might be different than their goal and their like fiduciary duty to their shareholders, right? And so when there's a conflict of interest there, potentially, not always, but sometimes, right? It's like who is going to hold people accountable and how, right? And as an individual person, like what right do you have in terms of understanding things, and who needs to be the one watching out for stuff? So I think those are the bigger questions that we were hoping, and especially because the Science Gallery has a lot of university students, we are excited because these are the people who might be shaping the ideas of fairness, not just in AI, but in general, right? These are future people in businesses, government, things like that, right? And so it was really exciting to get to make something for the people for the future decision makers.
And I think that's a really interesting point to sort of finish on, is, getting that message across. I teach, some of this sort of material in electives, which is across all the disciplines. And sometimes we perhaps over-focus, we do need to educate people in the computer science who hold the reins at the moment. But the trend is, these technologies, the use of these technologies gets better, and it'll be, accountants and quantity surveyors and restaurant managers who will start using these tools before long. So regardless of, what you're aiming to be, you are going to be more able to manipulate some of these sort of levers of quantification. So it's not just the computer scientists have to sort of grapple with all of these issues, I think. So I think we're nearly at the end of our slot. I can see there's one question that's come in on the Q&A, and I think we perhaps touched on this a little bit. What role do you feel quantitative data has in addressing issues around bias and fairness in AI models? And have you seen any methods applied with success? Which I think is a really good question, because I think we're still in an age where it's difficult to sort of disentangle the hype from some of these techniques from what's actually working. There's not a lot of large bodies of public information on what's working. Perhaps maybe I might sort of throw that in your direction. You've probably seen more of it go in front of your desk than some of the others. Are any techniques or combinations of techniques, perhaps not just quantified techniques, that you find are really working, that you put your money on if you are forced to make such a call?
Well, I think it is a pretty new area. So, and actually, whether we go down the road of regulation, which it looks like in the EU, or maybe more standards bodies, which other areas seem to be going down towards, I think that's part of it. Actually, raising awareness is part of it. I mean, actually, I'm involved in a project with the Monetary Authority of Singapore, where they're, for financial services institutions, they're trying to define methodology for fairness and ethics and accountability and transparency. But actually, the method for fairness, we've done step by step. Here are questions you should be answering, and all the way from the beginning. So there's qualitative questions at the very beginning when you're deciding to develop it, in terms of, why are you developing this? Why are you using AI? But then also, who's this going to be applied to? Who are the people it's going to be applied to, or the groups that might be most at risk, and why? And then based on those, what harms? So there's qualitative, and then as you're building the model, looking at the data and then the outcomes, it actually, defining your fairness metric and measuring against it. And this is another thing, the fairness metrics, and usually that's non-biased metrics in the lingo, but to unbias it in terms of statistical bias, you have to choose which one you want to optimize for, because you can't optimize for more. So you need to decide, is gender, is gender the group that you want to most protect, or is it race? Because oftentimes if you make one less biased, the impact is it could make the other more biased. So there's trade-offs to make as well. So we get into a lot of detail on that in the methodology. But interestingly, there's also a use case, and we actually, in terms of what worked, now it was we created a synthetic data set because no bank or insurance company want to use their real data, but for the use case which is published. But in the end, we found that there was, I'm trying to remember, there was a little bit of, we were looking at race and gender as our two sort of protected or the variables we wanted to optimize fairness for, and we were able to calibrate the outcomes for gender slightly differently to make it more fair for men and women, and that didn't actually adversely affect the race variable. So we were able, but at the moment, because techniques are new, we were a bit lucky. Do you know what I mean? That's the outcome. So we decided, okay, we should implement that. Whereas if it had been the opposite, that's a tough decision to make. Do you make it fairer for men and women and less fair for maybe some minority races? You know, so there's a lot of hard questions that have to be answered when you're looking at it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's not like, you know, dealing with those things in the real world. You know, it's why we do politics. You know, because we have different views and different biases, but also, you know, that debate goes forward. So, you know, I think what's really interesting, especially in the US, when they're talking about issues of, you know, public policy and bias, you know, there's this, what they refer to as intersectorality, the fact that, you know, it shouldn't be the story about, you know, whether solely women are biased against or African Americans biased against. It's African American.
The interconnection with women, yeah. But saying that, the right research is moving on. So there are a number of really promising papers at the moment, which actually are able to take into account multiple variables. But then you get into deep learning type models where, you know, there's a huge, you know, you almost don't even know what the variables are. So how do you know, so there's a lot of questions that still a lot of research is going into to be able to answer it. But it's a really interesting area.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, you know, to sum up, you know, there's a lot to learn, and I think, you know, there's positive routes we can go down and things we need to be sort of cautious about. But I suppose overall we need to keep imaginative and keep a critical eye on what we're doing. So I just want to sort of perhaps wrap up. We only have a minute or so left. I just want to thank our panelists.
There's another question.
Sorry. Oh yes, I see. Yes, well spotted. There was another question. Okay, so Mary's asking, if a person tried to get long time to play the game by completing the evaluation twice, so we're getting into cheating perhaps here. Was there a big difference depending on whether the person had done it once and had learned from what the machine, what from going through the process once and coming back to it? Was that something you looked at either as the thing was deployed?
Absolutely. The short answer is yes. But as with all of like examining data, it's more complicated than that, because first of all, if somebody, because when you're talking about do they do better, right? It's how many balls can they get through the maze. First of all, that means that they've already played it once, so they have an idea of how well the maze moves. It also means that they've done the assessment before, so they know what the tasks are, and they have a better chance of doing better at them because they don't have to figure out what they're supposed to do. They can just execute, right? So first of all, yes, you can usually get more time, and then also you're usually better at it. But it's also further compounded by the fact that in building it, we assumed that. We assumed that if people had done it, they would be better. So one of the questions when you start is, have you ever completed this assessment before? If you have, it skips the orientation and it gives you a bump to comprehension. And because of that, you are more likely to get more time. So it's like, not only is it naturally there, but in a system that was trying to reflect that, we actually ended up exacerbating that, right? And so, and I think that's I feel like that really shows how when people, like, that was an honest thing. We weren't trying to like mess with people. It's something that we foresaw, but we were like, well, luckily, like when you're making an artwork, you can just go for it. You don't have to necessarily find all the solutions. You just have to be able to ask the right questions. But it is something, those things of like how much is built in determines the result in the end.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's just that natural action when something's really engaging. We want to, you know, there's always people who want to stretch the parameters of the game and figure out how to get around and take that as a challenge. But that's something we should all be thinking about. So perhaps I'll just, I think we're at the top of our time now. So I just want to say a massive thank you to Maeve and Risa and Milo, and also to our colleagues at Jane and Aisling and their team at the Science Gallery for facilitating this event. And I believe that the exhibit is still open for a few more days. So if you haven't seen it, we would encourage you to try and get into Dublin, keeping your mask on, and go and enjoy the exhibit, and hopefully learn a bit more about fairness and bias and AI.